All right, we now have a joint presentation from a speaker we heard from earlier, which is Professor Michelle Waycott. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Claire Sims. Claire is a Principal Hydrologist with the Department for Environment and Water. Claire holds a Masters of Science in Hydrology and provides technical and modelling advice to a wide range of operational, environmental and policy projects focusing on the Murray-Darling Basin, particularly the Lower Lakes, Coorong and Murray Mouth region. Claire is leading the Department for Environment and Water modelling effort for Healthy Coorong Healthy Basin, working closely with a team from the University of Western Australia to develop and apply the Coorong Dynamics Model. So welcome, Claire.
Just a bit lower. Thanks for having me today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to what's known as the Coorong Dynamics Model and tell you how it came about. So much like a lot of the research that you've heard today, modelling has a bit of a history in the Coorong. Why? The Coorong is big and complex, and a model helps us understand environmental processes and responses over varying temporal and spatial scales. We can't monitor everything everywhere, so the model helps us fill gaps, ask questions and compare scenarios. How do we do this? So the foundation for the Coorong Dynamics Model is what's called a two-flow FV. FV relates to flexible mesh, hydrodynamic model. So you can see there that we've got a representation of what we call the model domain, or the extent of the model. So we take this bathymetry, which is essentially the lay of the land or the floor of the Coorong. It represents the physical features of the system. And then over that we build a model mesh, which looks very busy there because it is. And this represents the hydrodynamics of the system. Hydrodynamics is fluids in motion, how water moves. We have very good data sets to validate the performance of this model, and that gives us confidence that you can then build complexity upon that. And so, as I've said there, we can add functionality by coupling this two-flow FV model with other models that have been developed for other specific purposes with the same extent to help us answer more complex questions. And as you've seen today, the science is presenting some nice complex questions to address. So in terms of building the model, so as I said, we start with this bathymetry, so the lay of the land. So that's a digital elevation model of the Coorong, and we also have, over time, we've had targeted bathymetric surveys to define the bed elevation and shape of the Coorong. So you can see there as an example, you can take a cross-section at any point across that and understand what the bed elevation is. We then build a mesh that represents that same spatial extent. So all of these little tiny squares are cells or elements, and every single one of those has corners, which we call nodes, and every single node of those about 26,000 mesh elements for that extent have a place in space, so an X and a Y coordinate and also a depth. These cells are the scale at which the processes occur in the model. So these layers are the core components of the underlying two-flow hydrodynamic model. So you can see there that in our high-resolution model, those cells represent about 50 metres across. We also have a coarser mesh of the same extent. For comparison, those cells are about 300 metres across, and there's about 2,000 cells across the whole Coorong. So when we apply this model, we're assuming a static Murray mouth. It's a fixed survey of the Murray mouth is imposed, and we're not doing anything to do with the way sediment moves or anything in the Coorong. However, we can build in some new information now around using the sediment module. So using all of the data, in particular that Luke's project has collected, we've defined 31 sediment zones. So that's groups of cells into zones, and that's informed by the sediment sample data. So that includes grab samples, particle size samples, and cores. So you can see we've got a pretty good spatial spread thanks to all of Luke's team's data. And in terms of how we represent that in the model, this has been a massive leap forward in our capability. So you can see there that we've got a bit of a representation. So the zones are made up of a whole bunch of cells grouped together, and then critically, we can now represent the interaction between the water column and the underlying sediment. So that captures particle fluxes from the water column down to the sediment and dissolved fluxes that Luke referred to going from the sediment up into the water column. And in terms of our representation, the cells in the zone are averaged and feed into the underlying sediment. We also have an ability to couple the model to a wave model to understand sediment, or to simulate, I should say, sediment resuspension and the impact of that on water quality. So the wave model, the bathymetry for it is there on the left, and again, as part of Luke's component, some excellent targeted data was collected about significant wave height at a few locations. So the model can predict the spatial pattern of that significant wave height and also the wave periods. So therefore you're capturing waves and also the effects of currents in the Coorong. So these models can all be what we refer to as coupled, joined together basically, configured and applied in various ways to address a range of questions. So we've got the option of just sticking with the hydrodynamics if we want, and then we can bolt on all of this other functionality. And all of these models, which I'll go on to show you, have been basically customised for the Coorong using all of the science that the trials and investigation projects have derived. So speaking to some of that data collection to drive this model development. So as I mentioned, there's been a long history of modelling in the Coorong, so we had a pretty clear idea of what some of the gaps of knowledge are around as they relate to our ability to model processes in the Coorong. So the key ones for the modelling perspective were around quantifying nutrient cycling and habitat changes. Obviously, we wanted to make use of the best available scientific research in the data. And then we want to have confidence that we can then use that model to answer a whole range of questions, including considering options for infrastructure, restoration, operations, and the like. So this fed into the targeted investigation. So I've just captured some of the key components that you've already heard about today and the types of data, or the focus, I should say, of their various investigations. We also have ongoing data collection, so I flagged those sites in the Coorong. They're continuously monitoring a whole range of parameters, water level, salinity, and various water quality. And so those, and you can view all of those online anytime you like, but they're very important data sets, and they've got a good, very good temporal resolution, so they're continuous. And then we're supporting that as well. We've continued for 3 years now, and we're still continuing routine water quality monitoring. So we've got 20 sites spread across the Coorong, and our monitoring team go out every month and get grab samples, and they're processed for us for a whole range of detailed water quality parameters. And so ultimately the key developments that have occurred in the Coorong Dynamics Model, leveraging all of these data sets, are around what you've got there. So nutrient cycling and metabolism, the sediment biogeochemistry, rupia habitat, and also the interaction with algae, and then this waves and resuspension influence. So just to translate that into components there on the left of the research plus the monitoring, the types of data sets that they collected, and then ultimately where that feeds into the various models that we're bolting together to call the Coorong Dynamics Model. You can see that there. So I suppose it's just to underline that it's been completely critical with that data collection, and it's been a very important process, and we couldn't have improved the model without it. We had some, I suppose, research-based representations of some of these processes, but as we know, the Coorong is a very unique system, so the more data that we can collect, the more that we can make the models represent the system with confidence. So on to that in terms of confidence in the model. So we want to be certain that the model performs and can replicate history to therefore inform how we might manage it going forward, the system, I should say. So in terms of validation of the model, so validation is taking a modelled output and comparing it against observations over that time period to assess how it performs. So as I said, we've got those in situ water quality sensors. So you can see here, the model does a good job at representing the spatial variability along the length of the Coorong in terms of water level, and also the temporal changes, both small and large. So that seems very simple, but that's pretty critical. You want to make sure it can show you where the water moves before you try and add any other complexity in. As I said, we've had an ongoing program of water quality grab samples. So you can see there, this is just a couple of examples in the South Lagoon. We've got the modelled line in the blue with the bounds of confidence around it, and then measured total nitrogen on the top plot there. And then at the bottom, we've got modelled in the blue and measured in the little purple triangles of measured oxygen in the South Lagoon. So that's the water column, just as an example, water quality. Biotic surveys, so Michelle's spoken about all of the extensive data collection for the Rupia surveys. So the complexity of Rupia has been bundled up in the model in what's called a habitat suitability index. So Rupia and algae have been used to further develop the specific Rupia HSI, as we call it, and also a dedicated filamentous algae variable in the model that allows us to model the interactions. Thank you. So the data has been used to refine the modelled representation of each life stage and the response to environmental conditions, so water level, salinity, light and temperature, and then it predicts the suitability of conditions for each life stage. So you can see there that the shading is the modelled representation of habitat suitability versus the observed values, which are the dots there. So this allows, you can see that we can't sample everywhere all the time, so you build up confidence in the model to predict it across the full spatial extent of the Coorong. And we've done some further refinement as well about how we represent the model's performance to put a bit of a buffer around some of those sample points. And then the last but not least is this more strategic experimental data. So the sediment data is a great example of that. And as I said, there's been a range of data, some dedicated surveys, and also the more extensive rapid assessment, which allows a greater number of sites to capture sediment data. As I said, the greatest, I suppose, leap forward in the modelling has been our ability to undertake pretty comprehensive nutrient budget assessments. So this is a bit of modelling speak, but essentially we've got a dynamic, depth-resolved sediment diagenesis model. So incredibly complex sediment model capturing processes within the sediment and its interaction with the overlying water column. So as I said, we take those hydrodynamic model grid cells, they get bunched up into zones, and then we've got an ability to represent that interaction. So you can see there that we've got an example here for nitrogen. So you can see in the red, that's sediment releasing nitrogen up into the water column, and then you've got the, so that's the sediment dissolved fluxes, sediment up into water, particle fluxes is water down into the sediment, and we can also look at the sediment's ability as a long-term source or sink of nutrients. And you can see in the bottom right-hand there that the South Lagoon is a major nitrogen sink for sediment in the sediment. And after all that, what do we want to use the model for? It's to answer questions. And there's innumerable applications for it, but so far we've done answered some questions around more sort of standard levers that we pull in the operational settings. So looking at salt export from the Murray Mouth, barrage release optimisation, timing, split, volume, Salt Creek releases. It's been used extensively to date to look at the various infrastructure options assessments so far. So looking at the ability to represent pipes and pumping regimes. We can, as I say, we've done short-term runs, so about a 3-year period to compare scenarios. So that's the important thing to clarify. It's a relative comparison. We always have a base case looking at the historical period. What if we changed the pumping regime? What does that do to salinity and water level? This is for a site in the South Lagoon. We can consider climate change questions by pulling different levers in the model setup. But really, we're only just beginning to explore the possibilities as we start to think about the types of questions we want to ask the model. And with that, it's just worth flagging that the model development is a pretty constant process. So we're still continuing to collaborate with the University of Western Australia. They're doing some refinement, which they're about to wrap up as we speak. So we've done a big consolidation of all the modelling effort that occurred in phase 1 to bring all of the benefits from the different modelling efforts together. So some mesh improvements, some modelled representation improvements, making use of absolutely all of the data collected in phase 1, some updated nutrient budget analysis and some refinement of that sediment model, the extension of the model boundary conditions, so that's all the environmental conditions that drive the model. We've now got those updated until April 2023, and they'll be continually validated against that routine water quality monitoring. So critically, we've extended it as far as we possibly can to current to capture the flood, but with a note of caution that it's kind of unknown territory. We haven't really pushed the model that far before, so that will be very interesting to see what sort of results we get out of that and interpret those with caution. But yeah, continued refinement of model confidence and uncertainty. So it's always important to put the bounds of confidence in anything that we report. Oops, cool.
That was great. Thanks very much, Claire. I'll now hand over to Michelle to continue on about knowledge translation and application.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going to slow the technical stuff down a little bit and talk about how we used all the information that has come together over this program that you've heard outlined this morning, and Claire's very, very useful description of the model and how it works and how we have started using it. But when we talk about projects like this, and this is a very large program of work, the breadth and the extent and the depth of the science that's being undertaken is considerable. And often what happens with these big programs is you wait until around about now, so the project finished a year ago, we all get together and we have, say, a workshop like this, and we say, oh, what does that all mean? Well, what we did in this program from the outset, we recognised the need to integrate the science as we went along, and I had the incredible experience and privilege of leading this amazing team of people. What we did was we set out from the outset and said there's a range of key activities we have to undertake that allows us to bring the information together in a useful way, and a useful way with 3 major outcomes. The first of which was that the program itself could use knowledge, data and interpretation quickly during the course of running the program. And remember, today you've heard mostly about the investigations, the research side of the program. Alongside that, as Nadine talked about this morning, we have the Coorong infrastructure, we have on-ground works, and then we have a range of other decision making that sits around this information that we provide. We wanted the information, therefore, to go into a framework that was able to be used in a short time frame, but also with a long-term view. So that set up a series of challenges. We had the startup was also to recognise that we're not starting from scratch. There's incredible background of knowledge out there, and so we brought that together with all of the projects that you heard from this morning and more to get the baseline set. Then we knew one of our major tools for interpreting things was going to be modelling, which is why we invested so heavily in the modelling component of work, but also because developing models does something that many straight biological ecologists don't often get. It forces you to hone your questions and be able to actually really answer what you do and don't know, because the model really tests your knowledge and tests your understanding. We also then had an active program of work to integrate into agency and wider policy and decision making. And then we had an active program of looking to the future. Now, the session this afternoon that Jodie is going to be talking to you about has come out of this work, a genuine recognition we needed to take a whole of system approach to understanding the restoration of the Coorong itself. And so we worked really closely with the researchers, with the managers, and with other external partners to work out what that is, and then we tried to produce the right information for that. Now, one of our major pieces of work we've been doing was contributing to things like these brochures that are out the front. I really encourage you to review them. But anyway, this team was amazing, but it did include a really active collaboration with the University of WA modelling team, and Matt Hipsey, in fact, did his PhD here on the Lower Lake, so it's not like he was coming in and didn't know what we were talking about. It was a really good interaction. You've seen this slide or bits of it a few times. One of the challenges of a big program is bringing all the parts together for each of these projects, and you probably got the sense this morning and this afternoon that there has been a lot of interaction across the program. That was very genuine, and the project leads all had regular catch-ups, and I just want to thank Goita's leadership on helping facilitate that. That was very effective for linking into this integration work. So how does this integration all work? Essentially, these projects were bringing in new science, and you might say, well, so what? We've already heard some questions around whether or not investing in science was really valuable. Well, I might be biased, but I'm going to say yes, because what we did was we went into this synthesis and integration step where we started using that science in meaningful ways. One of the things we did early on was we were posed with a challenge by the program leader then, Gus McGregor, and he said, you know, how do we know what kind of system we're after? And so we went through an exercise right at the beginning of the project of bringing together the current state of knowledge of the system and using the current policy frameworks as well as ecological theory to say, here's what we're after, and we developed this state of the Coorong desirable state piece of work, which I'll talk about in a minute. We then started proactively building evidence bases for particular decisions, and then that's actually gone into seeking these achievable outcomes. So this cycle has actually led straight into direct problem solving, and I'd like to think even in the short-term life of this project so far, we've been able to make a significant difference. Whoops, back. This is a very busy slide. What it's trying to tell you is that the new evidence that's come in from these 6 components of work was then put through essentially the machine of integration and come out the end with a whole range of outputs, including a really dedicated knowledge sharing data set, which we've been working on how to share with the world. And the knowledge generated within this project is going to be and has been already quite important. Data collected has been curated in a very clean and coordinated way. Those data sets have now been compiled into a resource and they're going to be made available on public repositories. Some of them already are as they get cleared through the process. And this is really important because for those of you who've ever been involved, we're trying to trawl through old data sets to find the bit that you want to use. What this is going to do is set up really transparent historical baseline for this project, because it's not only the new data, many of these data sets include some of the historical data sets. So this has been a critical piece of work. It's also recognising that the data has to be used to be valued, and putting some constraints around how it gets used. So there are some pieces of data, and I think the Ngarrindjeri Knowledge Project's a good one, where the data sets they're accumulating are going to be managed by them, and there's going to be transparency and traceability around how they share that data. And the same with the ecological, biophysical and sociological data. That knowledge sharing is also then going to be quite transparent, because data accessibility will be required. And then the store of knowledge goes then into a cyclic process where you can keep building. And the current data sets, even though the main HHB project has wrapped up for phase 1, we've had some trickle-on pieces of work, and those data sets are going to accumulate alongside the other ones. Another fundamental principle of the integration program has been that there are diverse audiences and diverse activities, from citizen science to this really long list of things that were included in the program. I think it's really important that we recognise that we weren't just doing the research for the scientists or the managers, we're doing it for the community and different types of community groups. And fundamentally, we've tried to produce outcomes from the projects and interpret them and share them meaningfully. The integrated knowledge also can then get translated and be used in many ways, and this is just a summary graphic that we included in this one of these brochures, which really helps people understand the system and what they're talking about or what they're reading about when they're looking at the system, because not everyone has the same level of background knowledge. And I know I've learnt things today, and I've certainly sat through most of these talks before. So it always depends on, how people present, your context on the day, and what other background knowledge you've accumulated. So creating some of these information products is really quite useful. Now, I mentioned before the state of the Coorong. Now, this piece of work we started it right at the beginning of the project in 2020, and then it's gone through several iterations, and we're currently finishing up the post-end of phase 1 version of it. And it allows us to put a framing around what our definition of the current state of the system is. And this is just one of the lines. This relates to the work Luke was talking about. What will happen if we don't do anything at all, the do-nothing state, what we think a good desired state would be based on targets and reasonable expectation of a functioning system, not assuming a static state, Mike. And then what kind of ideas do we have to get there? And this is essentially a living set of targets that we can update as our knowledge increases and our expectations of the system change. That's just saying we're updating them. And they can we can visualise these graphically or with words, or we could do model runs that, like Claire just talked about. So there's lots of ways of sharing this information. And for some parts of the system, like the ones that, like this example, which I've worked on, we have very clear ideas about how to translate that into a whole range of different ways. For other parts of the system, it's a bit more challenging. So Claire mentioned in her talk that there's a whole range of model application that's possible. And I wanted to put this up to remind us that we're now at a point where we can start to really take advantage of the outputs of this program and start asking challenging model application questions. What do we want to know that these tools will allow us based on our understanding of the system? And what challenge does that give us? Perhaps some of the knowledge isn't quite as robust as we'd like to think. And this is where we get into the really pointy end of what we expect in the future, and that's the phase we're entering right now. As Claire described, the model validation steps and the improvements are allowing us to get to a much more detailed pointy end here. And this is just to remind us that we can go through these processes, but we're going to come up with some knowledge gaps again. So we have invested an incredible body of work, but we won't have answered all the questions because some of the questions we're having now have come out of the research that we did. And some of those things were not completely unexpected, but they're completely a different scale to what we originally thought they might have been. And that's really useful because that helps us get on the right page for what we do next. So I just thought I'd better put a flood slide up. This is my view of the flood, where the water was just really high and it never went down. And it created lots of grief for us doing our sampling in the system. But one of the opportunities we have is to look at what's happened in the system as a result of this extended period of high water. And for example, working on the aquatic macrophytes on the Ruppia community, we've lost Ruppia from around Noonamina. Not surprising because the salinity got down to less than 10 parts per thousand there. But watching how the system recovers after that is going to be quite important and I think quite informative for what's going to happen in the future, as long as we join the dots and also measure the sediment nutrient concentrations, as Luke's been talking about, as long as we understand where the fish and the invertebrates are in the system. So these are important next steps. And speaking of important next steps, next session, we've got Jodie's going to talk about the restoration roadmap, but I just wanted to echo to you here that restoration roadmap is trying to bring together everything into a way forward in the future that should reflect where we've got to now and help us get on track. Thanks.